Chapter here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Patricia Engel and Naima with us tonight. To, of course, celebrate the launch of Patricia's newest collection of short stories, The Faraway World. But, yes. Before we get into all of that, however, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, for all of you out in the audience, we do ask that you keep your mask on at all times while in the store. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of tonight's discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Patricia will be signing and personalizing books at the table next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And finally, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of The Faraway World online using the link in the live stream description. All right, so let's get into this. I always find an incredible mix of pleasure and anguish when reading Patricia's work, and The Faraway World, of course, lives up to every expectation. These 10 stories follow characters searching for something more in their lives, and altogether examines the diasporic experience with nuance and empathy. Patricia Engel is the author of Infinite Country, a New York Times bestseller and Reese's Book Club selection, The Veins of the Ocean, winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, It's Not Love, It's Just Paris, winner of the International Latino Book Award, and Vida, a finalist for the PEN Hemingway and Young Lion Fiction Awards and winner of Columbia's National Book Award. Her short stories appear in Best American Short Stories, the Best American Mystery Stories, the O. Henry Prize Stories, and elsewhere. Born to Colombian parents and herself a dual citizen, Patricia is an associate professor of creative writing at the University of Miami. And as I mentioned earlier, Naima joins Patricia in conversation tonight. Naima is a New York Times bestselling author of 2 novels, most recently What's Mine and Yours, and a recipient of the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 Under. Naima's stories and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Elle, The Cut, the Sunday Times, and Catapult, among other publications, and in numerous anthologies. She earned her MFA at the Columbia University School of the Arts and has taught writing for over a decade in community settings, youth programs, and universities. All right, that's all for me. Without any further delay, please join me in giving Naima and Patricia a very warm welcome.
Okay, sure. So first, thanks everybody for coming and braving the traffic and the cold. I haven't lived in New York for a long time, so I forgot what it's like. But now I remember everything.
Good memories.
So I see some familiar faces. Thank you all for coming out, especially the best agent in the world, Aisha, who's over there, Lauren, Alex, my editorial team, my old friends and dear ones and loved ones, and Naima, who is so brilliant and so talented. And we're kind of book sisters because our last novels came out on the same day. They were born the same day. So I'm going to read from the first story in The Faraway World. It's called Aida. It's set in the suburbs, sort of around here. So here we go. The detective wanted to know if Aida was the sort of girl who would run away from home. He'd asked to talk to me alone in the living room. My parents stood around the kitchen with the lady cop and the other detective, an old man who looked to be on his last days of the job. I sat in the middle of the sofa, my thighs parting the cushions. The detective sat on the armchair our mother recently had reupholstered with a fleur-de-lis print, because the cat had clawed through the previous paisley. The old man detective was telling my parents that Aida would walk through that front door any minute now. She probably just got distracted, wandered off with some friends. Our mother wasn't crying yet, but she was close. He looked young to be a detective. He wore jeans with a flannel shirt under a tweed blazer, even though it was August. He wanted to know if Aida ever talked about leaving, like she had plans beyond this place, something else waiting for her somewhere. I shook my head. I didn't tell him that since we were 11, Aida and I kept a shoebox in the back of our closet under some long forgotten stuffed animals that we called our runaway fund. The first year or two, we added every extra dollar we came across, and when our piles of bills became thick and messy, we took them to the bank and traded them for 20s. We planned to run away and join a group of travelers, sleep under bridges beside other refugee kids, and form orphan families like you see in movies and Friday night TV specials. Those were the days before we understood how much our parents needed us. Aida insisted on taking the cat with us. Andromeda was fat but could fit in her backpack. Aida had lied to our parents and said she found the cat alone one day by the river behind the soccer field, but she really bought her by the pet shop with some of our runaway savings. I didn't mind. The cat always loved her more than me, though. Did she have a boyfriend? Somebody special? The detective asked. She didn't. Neither did I. Our parents told us boys were a big waste of time, and we kept busy with other things. School, sports, jobs, painting classes for Aida and piano lessons for me. Our parents said just because we were girls who lived in a small town didn't mean we had to be small town girls. Did she have any secrets? Not from me, I said. Even twins keep secrets from each other. He made me tell him all over again what happened, even though I'd gone through it several times in the kitchen while the old man detective took notes and the lady cop leaned against the refrigerator, arms folded across her blockish breast. The young detective said he'd keep whatever I told him in the strictest confidence. If there's something you left out because your parents weren't around, now is the time to tell me. There's nothing, I said, and repeated all I'd already told him. How Aida was coming off her summer job as a gift wrapper at the children's department store at the bottom of Elm Avenue while I was sweeping and cleaning the counters before closing at the coffee shop on the top end, where I worked the pastry case. We had this routine. Whoever finished her shift first would call to say they were on their way to the other, or we'd meet halfway at our designated third bench on the sidewalk in front of the park, and we'd walk home together. That night, a little after 7, Aida had called and said, "I'll come to you." When she didn't show up, I took my purse and walked around the intersection to the park. I sat on our bench for a few minutes before walking the park periphery to see if maybe she'd run into some of the kids from school. Aida was friendly with everyone, even the dropouts most everyone in town avoided, though they hung around the bus station and liquor store, and you couldn't walk through the park without getting a whiff of their weed. Aida had a smile for everyone. People liked her. Sometimes I got the impression they just tolerated me because we were a package deal. I called her phone, but she didn't answer. Then I tried our parents to see if they'd heard from her, and it started from there, the calling around. Probably for the first time ever, the town employed that emergency phone chain where each person is assigned 5 others to call to see if anyone had seen Aida. Around here, you can't get a haircut without it being blasted over the gossip wires, but nobody knew where she was. This is a town where nothing terrible ever happens. There are perverts and creeps, like anywhere else. But the worst crime that this town has ever seen is an occasional housewife wandering the supermarket with a broken nose or a split lip. And also back in 1979, when one sophomore girl stabbed another with a pencil in the high school cafeteria. The old man detective reminded us we had the good fortune of living in one of the safest towns on the East Coast. This isn't some third world country, he told our mother. The likelihood that your daughter was kidnapped is extremely remote. He told our parents it was common for teenagers to test boundaries. If only he had $1 for every time a parent called looking for a kid who turned out had just taken off to a rock concert at the Meadowlands or hopped in a car with some friends and headed down the shore. And it had only been 4 hours, he emphasized. Aida couldn't have gotten very far. Our mother argued that 4 hours could take her to Boston, to Washington, so far into Pennsylvania that she might as well be in another country. 4 hours was enough to disappear into nearby New York City, her dark, pretty face bleeding into millions of others. But the old detective insisted, 4 hours is nothing, ma'am. You'll see. You'll see. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for reading for us, Patricia, and thank you all for being here to celebrate the launch of Patricia's new book. I'm honored to be in conversation with you because, as you know, I've been a longtime admirer. I've been a fan for over a decade, since I first read Vida. It was a book that spoke deeply to me because of its sensitive and sharp investigation of diaspora, desire, family, belonging, its toughness and candor. And so it's very exciting to see another story collection from you all of these years later. And as you know, I wrote about Vida in my MFA application statement, which I mentioned. It was such an influential book, and I'm just so grateful for your literary impact and to have this collection where I think you're at the height of your powers, your formidable powers. So thank you. I wanted to ask you about the origin of these stories, the first seed of each one. They're all so varied and rich, and I tried to figure it out as I was reading, but it's difficult because the stories have so many compelling elements. Character, point of view, setting, and the voice, and I couldn't always tell where they started from. So I was curious about what those first seeds are for you.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a tricky one with this collection because they were written over a really long period of time, 10 or 12 years, and obviously my life went through major changes at that time. I was interested in different things, traveling to different places, in different relationships, meeting different people, and all of that, as you know, as a writer, affects your thinking, affects your philosophical approaches to life, and all of that is in here somehow. In terms of how I sit down, actually begin a story and get it done, I have learned through trial and error, I don't know if it's the same for you, to really think on a story for a long time before I sit down to write it, because to avoid that dreaded feeling of just launching with inspiration and then writing yourself into the wall and then you losing all steam and focus and forgetting why you even started, right? What you were thinking about. So I really try to almost see the story in its entirety like a movie in my mind and know it well enough to sit down and write it, almost as if I'm blindfolded, because I can see it in that way. But the ideas really come from all around. They come from everything. And sometimes I don't even know that they are ideas until they make a connection with something else in my mind that I've already been thinking about. And those threads start to come together, sometimes quicker, sometimes they take years to come together and merge. And I'll usually start from a voice, from an image, or just even from an emotional note that I find as a point of entry, or even as an end point. I think I want to write a story and I'd like it to end with this kind of feeling, and how am I going to get there? And then I have to start to understand the map for it.
Yeah, that's such important wisdom, the idea that a story isn't something just to be executed. You sit down and plow through it, but that the thinking time is work too. I'm very interested in your approach to endings, and the first story in the collection, which you read to us from, Ida, was so compelling to me. It was anthologized, for those of you who don't know, in Best American Mystery Stories. You got to hear what it's about. And I was so intrigued by the idea of the sister who's left behind, who has to grapple with that loss. And all of the questions that she and her family have are the questions that I had. Will her sister be found? Is she dead? Is she alive? If she's alive, will they be reunited? If she's dead, what happened to her? And it's a story that's really about living with questions. And not always having good answers, which I loved as a theme, but I thought, what a challenge for a writer to write a story about living with questions when there are expectations of genre and readerly desire for closure and illumination. And so I wondered how you thought about the ending of that story. We won't give it away. And also how you think about endings more broadly, how you know when a story is whole.
This is why it's so fun talking to another writer, like at these things.
Tell me, give us your secrets.
Because the questions are so good, and I have to think, hard, because you're right. I think as humans, we hate to live with questions. We hate to live with, things that have no answers and no explanations, and I think that's when we start to make things up and tell ourselves stories about why things are the way they are, because that's That's how we survive, is finding order and making sense of things and making meaning. And sometimes there is no meaning. There's no lesson to be learned. Things just happen. With that story with Aida, I started, that story came together very intensely from the start, but had been building for years based on a few different elements. I had seen a true crime show, and it was about a girl who'd gone missing. And I'd been really affected by, when they interview the families in these kinds of shows, and just the expression on this family that was living with her absence that really impacted me. So that was one thing. Another thing is I have no sisters, so I've always been fascinated about like the sisterly bond, especially twins, because I know a lot of twins, and that's like a whole other level, right? So I wanted to explore that. And this is a side note, I used to be really into those Time Life Mysteries of the Unknown books. They're about like ESP and things like that. And, they say that twins have like a kind of ESP. So I wanted to write into that. And less away from the horror of what might have actually happened to her. And, so it wasn't like a detective story. It sounds like it based on what I just read, but it's not. And about a family just surviving in that void of not knowing, maybe never knowing, and having to imagine what possibly happened to this girl. Of course, I'm a writer, and like you've got readers, and you have to. They're going to be complaining one way or another because you're not answering all their questions. But I also wanted to resist that, because I think as writers we get to ask a lot of questions. It doesn't mean we have to answer them too, And I actually enjoy books like that leave me with a lot of questions. Those might be the books that I most enjoy. And so I kind of freed myself to explore that. Again, when you finish a story, you never know if you pulled it off. You have no idea.
You pulled it off.
Thank you. But that's what I was trying for, and that's the thing I enjoy about writing stories, is they're all kind of experiments.
Yeah, well, I found the ending astonishing, and I was grateful to revisit it before our conversation. It's an interesting story to begin the collection, because there are lots of missing people in these stories for different reasons, like people who are missing because they have passed, people who are missing because they've moved to another country, they've migrated, there's been some sort of disconnection or loss or disappearance. And one of the things that I love about your work that was alluded to in the introduction is that you don't shrink away from the brutality of life in your stories. And yet I found myself struck as I was reading this book about how much hope there is in this collection. And by hope, I don't mean a silver lining, like things seem bad, but they're not so bad. But rather that the characters are able to make meaning or make do. They still have longing at the end of the stories, things that they're anticipating. Sometimes you wish they wouldn't. Sometimes you understand and hope that they do. And I was curious whether hope is something that you think about in your writing. And I ask this with an awareness that writers who write about immigrants and people of color are often under pressure to write narratives of triumph. So I'm just curious how you think about that, if you do.
Again, a really good question, Naima, that I'm going to think about tonight before I go to sleep.
What is hope?
And again, those are questions that are ongoing, right? Those are things that we think about from book to book, story to story. And sometimes people will say things like that, like there's brutal stuff in my stories or tough stuff. And I don't know, I don't see it like that, really. I really don't. I just try to write towards the truth of life. But I do believe that all of life is like on a continuum, a whole spectrum. You cannot have good without the hard times. You cannot grow without the challenges. And I like to show those contrasts. And I like to show the ways we go through things and get through things. And hope is a through line. I think it's an energetic force that gets us out of bed every morning. That hope to make your day better than the day before, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't do anything. And so I like the energy of hope, that it propels us into motion. It makes us do things. It makes us create our days. It makes us create our relationships. It makes us create our work. It makes us do everything in one way or another. If we didn't have hope, we would be stagnant, right? But that doesn't mean that there's perfection in it. Hope is often flawed. It's often full of error. It often goes backwards before it goes forward. So I like to write about all those stumblings through hope as well.
Yeah, I love that, the idea of stumbling through hope. And, I think when I said that your work confronts the brutality of life, that's also sort of me perhaps adopting like a common readerly response that I find to work. Like the work is bleak, the work is tough, but it's also, it's real. It's grounded in, the facts of our lives. So thank you for that. I'm curious if there was a story in this collection that stumped you or really tried you, that brought you to the limits of your own hope. Anything that really was particularly challenging to write and how you found your way through it.
Yes, again, a question only a writer could ask, right? Yes, all of them, but some more than others, for sure. Maybe my favorite story, I don't know if I should pick a favorite, but one of my favorites in the collection is Fausto, which is the second story. And that story, even though I was happy with it when in its first incarnation, I continued to work on it for a very, very long time. It was first published in the public space by Bridget Hughes, and she made me work. And so that story, which I think I wrote it in 2010, it was published in 2011, I wrote it so long ago, went through a lot of work, and I was really pleased with how it came out. A lot of the stories went through many incarnations before they found their final forms. One of them, the Book of Saints, which is told like in two dueling voices of a husband and wife, and how they meet, and they both kind of have their own agendas with what they're bringing to this new relationship. And that one, psychologically, I had to do a lot of work for. But again, I enjoyed the challenge. So they all try you in different ways. As I was saying, that's the fun about writing stories. You come to experiment, you come to play, you come to push yourself, because it's not like it's going to kill you like a novel will, right?
Yeah. Well, both of those are killer stories with terrific endings, and endings that I couldn't predict either in terms of event or in terms of emotional resonance. So look out for those in your reading. I'm curious about your writing process, and I wanna be as nuts and bolts as possible so that we can all learn from you in terms of how you approach the writing of short stories in particular, whether you have rituals, whether you write multiple stories at once, if you take breaks from your novels with them, just anything about how these stories came into creation and how this book was built.
Yeah, because these stories were all written over 10 or 12 years. Most of them I wrote in between books, before, during, or after books. Some, maybe during a novel, but usually when I'm in the writing of a novel or in the revision of a novel, I'm focused on that. And then I'll, come to the stories to play, like when I'm in between revisions or something like that. That said, there's 10 stories in here. But during that same 10 or 12 years, I wrote a lot of other stories that are not here. So story writing is something I come to for fun. In terms of rituals, I don't have many. I have habits, but I try not to be too precious about my habits, because then I wouldn't get anything done, right? I prefer to write in silence, not music or anything. I prefer natural light. The only thing I am like particular to a point about is my notebooks, which I was saying the other day that they were discontinued, my favorite notebooks. So I spent a couple of weeks last year tracking down basically all the ones that I could find before they went like off the market, and I tracked them down to Canada. And I got like 50 from a little stationery shop in Montreal, and they're all mine now. And I'm not going to tell you what they are, but they come from Japan. So that's it. And you know, there's nothing magic about these notebooks. I just love the way they feel the surface because I do come back to the pen on paper.
Okay.
And that's where I do a lot of my pre-writing, my brainstorming, my note-taking, because I take a lot of notes so that when I'm deep in the writing, I can kind of keep track of myself, where I began, what I was trying to do, what I was thinking about. It's kind of like a map for me, my own notes. So I do a lot of planning, and this is like when I say notes, they're a mess.
Mm-hmm.
There's no order. There's no outlines. It's just a mess. But it helps me remember and keep the connection up to what I'm writing. So those are my only kind of firm, ongoing habits.
Yeah. I have a similar process, and whenever I skip it, it shows.
Yeah.
That the depth isn't there. Do you ever draft longhand or just the?
I do. I wrote It's Not Love, Just Paris entirely in notebooks before I took it to the computer.
Wow.
I wrote about half of the veins in the ocean by hand before I started typing. And then at a certain point, your hand just can't keep up. But that's when you're like, I got it. I think I know what I'm doing,
That's amazing. Why did you do it that way?
I think it's not like I'm imagining this. I think it's been scientifically proven that your brain just accesses a different space when you're writing by hand, and there's a freedom in that helps me because I write slower by hand than typing at this point. It slows me down. It makes me more deliberate with what I'm writing, and allows me to really start to enter the story in a more deliberate way. And then when I'm there, then it's just, the typing just kind of, takes off and, you already know where you're going. But I still love, I have the great pleasure of writing by hand. So my hands are all janky because of that.
Yeah. I hope people are taking notes. This is a question that there's a writer in the audience, Melissa Rivero, that when we were talking about your book, this is a question that she shared with me. We were curious about your relationship to the first person, because another writerly question. All of the stories in this collection are in the first person, and they're all different structurally, and the voices and points of view are different, but it's all first person. So we're curious about that.
Yes, I cannot deny my preference for the first person.
Yeah.
And I love to read first person. It's definitely my favorite as a reader, and that's probably why I write in first person more often than not. I love the intimacy of it. I love exploring different voices and what voices give away about a character. I love how the psychology and history of a character is impacted in every word that they speak, everything that they share and don't share. So I think there's, a really special magic about the first person. Not to say that in, second or third you don't get that, but it's certainly different. I like the vulnerability of the first person, and that's, I don't know, that's kind of where I feel more grounded. But it's not like I never write other ones.
Yeah. I had a mentor who once described voice, because there are differing definitions of it, right? Some people are like, it's how someone sounds, it's how they speak, diction, syntax, as the ground that a character is standing on, which I loved as a description of voice. And I don't know if that resonates with you, or if you think, no, that's not what voice is. But I found it useful, and you're standing on different ground in all of these stories. There are thematic commonalities, but you're able to show us the consciousness of so many different characters, which is that's the superpower of an amazing fiction writer. But I often think about like what equips each writer to write the stuff of their work. Like what are the unique experiences, whether they're personal experiences or reading experiences, exposures to ideas and beliefs that made it so that they could stand on that ground, and write the stories that only they could write. So I'm going to get a little nosy. but you get to decide how you answer it. And share with us what you think has, equipped you in your life, in your reading, to give us these particular stories.
Oh, Naima.
Why?
Again, this is a question for my journal, right?
I know, mine too.
What has equipped me to write these stories? Probably everything and nothing, I think one of the things that I like about writing is that you're both an authority, yet you know nothing when you begin a story. You think you know what you're doing, but then the characters teach you don't, and you have to come to it with some humility too. I grew up loving reading. I came from a very artistic family, and I just kind of live in the state of being inspired by watching life. And that's where it comes to me. I just see and feel things constantly. I don't know if I'm just a little extra sensitive. I just feel a lot of things all the time. You know what that's like. And for me, writing is a language of making meaning, as we were talking about earlier. And in that act of creating something, kind of providing portraits or mirrors or opportunities for recognition, not just for myself, but anybody who might encounter these stories. So they're all explorations of things I'm stumped by, questions I have about the world, things that I'm shocked by, horrified by maybe, or entranced by, delighted by, and it just kind of all comes together in a moment. And that's really what a story is. It's just a kind of a moment. And in a way, it's, I guess if you look back on everything that I've written, you can see that they're all in conversation with another. They're all explorations into similar territories of diaspora, of family relationships, a feminine experience, being a child, being a sister, being a daughter, a mother, a friend, all sorts of things. That's just kind of what excites me and fascinates me.
Your use of the word territories is interesting because I thought a lot about geography as I was reading this book, and there also are familiar places here. There are different places in Colombia. There's New York, New Jersey, Miami, several stories set in Cuba. And I wondered about what it is, or I imagine there are many things, that you're investigating about these places or interested in. We got a taste of the suburb in the beginning. That's supposed to be a place that affords safety, but the family that's there is troubled and haunted even before the disappearance of one of their daughters. But I'm just curious about your interest in these places.
Yeah, I kind of view place in a similar way, in that there are places that I think I know well, right? I've spent time there. I spent meaningful time there, meaningful periods of my life. But when I start writing about a place, I then like to displace myself from it in order to write it in how that place is a part of the lives of the characters. So I like feeling like both an insider and an outsider to these places when I start writing about them. I do research about places that I know very well. I grew up in the suburbs, but I didn't experience it in this way, and that's kind of like the play of estranging yourself from something, the defamiliarization of something that in an intimate way. Same thing with Colombia, different places in Colombia or in Florida or in New York, and in Cuba, where I spent a lot of time when I was doing research for the Veins of the Ocean. Again, I spent a lot of time doing research, and that's my life. I spent a lot of time there. It starts to affect you on a human level, and there were things that did not make their way into the novel, but stuck with me in a way that I felt, well, I want to explore this, and the way that I did that was through these stories.
One more question. Oh, okay. Let's see. All right. I find that and a common question on book tours, I'm not going to ask you the common question, is what do you hope readers will take away from this book? And maybe there are writers who are much better at answering this question than I am, but I always think, I don't know, there's a lot of stuff in there. You could take this, you could take this. That's up to you. So I think maybe a sister question to that question is, what are you most proud of? Like, what are the things that you feel like you pulled off or accomplished or offer in this collection that are meaningful to you?
That's a good question, Naima, because I don't think I ever stop to ask myself like what I'm proud of. You know, I just kind of do it. And
yeah, and I mean, this book is an offering, right? It's like an offering for us. So. If I can cite your Instagram post, but for an ancestors, descendants, I'm wondering what it is that you think you're offering here.
I think that that's also part of that experience is, you know, when you're a child of diaspora in some way and so much sacrifice happened before you, you're in this position of wanting to make everybody else proud, you know, so you don't quite stop to say, oh, what am I proud of, right? So what am I proud of here, Naima? Wow, you really made me think here. I'm proud of the whole thing in that I stuck with it, you know. I wrote a bunch of stories and they're okay, right? I didn't quit. And some of these stories made me want to quit at times. Some of them I hid for years and didn't look at them, you know. There, you asked me earlier about a story that, you know, really gave me a hard time. The last story was an emotionally challenging story, Aguacero. So maybe I'm proud of, you know, having done a lot of emotional work on my human journey to sort of approach harder things that maybe I would have avoided earlier on in my career.
Well, we're grateful for it. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.
We have time now for questions from the audience. Yes.
I have a question. Can you talk a bit about the title, not just of the collection, but maybe of some of the other? How do you come up with your title?
Do you want me to repeat that? I'll repeat it.
Yeah.
So the question is, can you tell us about the title, The Faraway World? How did you come up with it, and how do you find titles generally?
Generally, I take my sweet time coming up with a title for anything that I write because I find that very hard. I don't know how you feel about coming up with titles. It's not easy, right?
Yeah, no, it's terrible.
So this collection did not have a title for a long time, and I didn't burden myself with trying to come up with one. I thought, wow, I can just use the title of one of the stories, like often happens, you know. But during the course of putting this book together, towards the end, I think the book was already on its way, editing-wise. We found a photograph that had belonged to my grandfather that he'd saved somehow. And my grandfather was from Austria, and he left Austria right before World War II and went to Colombia for a job, and because the war could not return. So he ended up marrying and settling there and had 9 kids, including my dad. And so this photograph, you know, he was very young, he was in his 20s, was of his mother's grave, because she died when he was 5, and his grandparents, and it said, this is a farewell from your beloved son who is about to leave for the faraway world. And this was written in Old Austrian, which is even different. I guess I should know this from German, right? Okay, so we had to have it translated because we're all Colombians now and no one speaks German. And but that phrasing kind of stuck with me, and I thought maybe in the future I'll write something, you know, into that. And at a certain point, I told Lauren, my editor, I said, I want to call this collection The Faraway World. Are you okay with that? And she said, let's do it. So yeah, I mean, just to go on, I think that started to take more meaning as time went by, as I started to think about what this idea of the faraway world meant for my grandfather back then, what it means for all of us, you know, just kind of launching ourselves into the unknown in one way or another, a new job, a new relationship, moving somewhere, whatever, any kind of undertaking, and how all of that can be a force for change that we don't expect always. Any other questions?
Now's your chance.
Seems like you asked her all the best
I
questions.
know, Naima's so good.
Yes.
The short story is a really interesting form, and I feel like it usually often go from short stories to novels, or novels to short stories, or vice versa. So, like, how have you been finding the experience a little bit different from like writing a novel, editing a novel? Like, what's been exciting and different about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like I said, I've been writing stories the whole way through. You know, it's always kind of like a return to home for me in between longer projects that require much more time commitment or research commitments. But I was telling Naima this earlier. You know, for me, I love short stories as much as I love novels, and maybe more in a different way. I remember certain short stories that were introduced to me when I was in school that really made an impact. Like I was telling Naima that Ray Bradbury one about like the kids with the sun, and do you remember that one? What is it called again? Summer in a Day. It just came to me. Okay, All Summer in a Day. And this other story, Antaeus, and like they were all in some short story anthology I read in 7th grade, but like they made an impact, right? And then when I started writing seriously in grad school, we were talking about grad school, you know, you start writing stories because it's a way to experiment and try different things and move on to something else if it's not working. So I like that. I like the freedom. I also like sometimes you get a quicker payoff because you tend to write them quicker than novels. But even so, I can't not write novels. So I'll probably always do both.
Okay, yes, lots of hands. Great. Let's do Gray and then next Gray. And then we'll do
We coordinated this.
Yeah.
I'm really curious, and I really enjoyed the specific choice fiction when it came to the Spanish language in the collection, and I also really love the register that you're speaking in. You're using and referencing Spanish within the novel, within the collection. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts around it. Were they terms, or because a lot of it, some of it is very colloquial and very familiar. A lot of the times, were they things that just came naturally, or were there parts that you really have to think about on how you wanted to communicate?
Yeah, a lot of that comes down to how well you know the character at that point, and that's why it becomes important to really sit with the character long before you start writing them, so you don't then become the dictator of their voice. Rather, their voice starts to emerge naturally, and then it's really not that conscious, to be honest with you. The language just starts to attach itself to the identity of the character who's ever speaking. As a writer, you know, you have fun with the sentence and the language and the poetics and things like that, but really stuff like that, the way that a maternal language would infiltrate the dominant language of English, that's something psychologically particular to a character, you know, and that's something that's worked out within characterization and less so in language. And then it's just kind of listening to it.
So my question was, you say you often find yourself writing short stories when you're done revising a novel, and now that you're done revising a short story collection, do you know what your next writing project will be?
Yeah, I have. I'm in the very early stages of a novel, I'd say. Yeah.
We have to wait. We have to
Yeah,
wait
I
for the
can't
rest.
talk about it. I can't talk about them until I write them. Sorry.
I'm a huge fan, and I'm so grateful that you're here in New York. That was my question, but I just wanted to know if I want to like read your memoir, like if that's ever in your realm. So if you have I want to meet like the real Patricia. I think novel is your gift, your charm, but part of me is to talk because I really want to know like if the memoirs and the works.
It might be. It might be. You never say never. Right? Thank you, though, and thank you for coming out for your kind words. I really appreciate it.
I second that. I second that.
Well, let's put it to a vote.
Yeah. Where did the inspiration and the ending for Book of Saints come from?
Okay. The question was, where did the inspiration and the ending for the Book of Saints come from? I don't want to give away the ending, but just to tell you about the Book of Saints, that's a story that I mentioned earlier, which is a couple who start a relationship and become a husband and wife, and they because it's alternating voices, their perspectives, you get the intimacy and the confessions almost of each of these two characters, and that they both kind of have an agenda or are coming to this relationship to avoid other things. So it's not the usual love-seeking purposes that bring two people together. One is a young woman in Colombia, and the guy finds her through like an internet matchmaking service, and he's an American guy. So the inspiration came from, probably I have seen a lot of relationships that have, come together in these kind of unlikely ways, where people from very disparate backgrounds make a life together somehow, and like a lot of relationships, and maybe even more so, it's full of misunderstandings and miscommunications and thwarted expectations. But what interested me in writing it was about how these people, despite all that, it doesn't go where you expect. It actually turns, okay, we won't give it away totally. It turns into a maybe truer kind of love story. And they develop a very, I think, special kind of closeness in that, that kind of just handing themselves over to that relationship, even as imperfect or flawed as it starts out. And I like that. I like writing into the unexpected in relationships, and the ways that they subvert our prejudices and our preconceived notions about how people and situations should be.
Yeah, I love that story, if I may say. When I started, I thought, oh, this is going to be a mess. Not a mess of the story, but just what their relationship would be and the motivations. And it's one of the stories in the collection with the longest sort of scope. Like, it spans a long time. And as someone who can only be halfway decent at writing novels, I like to say novels are capacious, and that's what they offer us. But this short story has so much life in it, and such a long scope. So it's remarkable to see their relationship transform. Any other questions?
All right.
All right. Let's
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you so much. Thank you to Books Are Magic.
I'm just going to pop up here to say thank you once again to Patricia for celebrating this launch with us. Thank you, Naima, for moderating such a fantastic conversation. And thank you to everyone who asked questions. So, as I mentioned earlier, Patricia will be signing and personalizing books. My coworker, Anna, is going to point to where Patricia will be. It's our lovely little receiving desk, somewhat hidden. But we're going to ask that you all form an orderly line down the center aisle and then loop around the table. If you haven't purchased this collection yet, we've got plenty of additional copies available, as well as a few copies of Naima's novel, What's Mine and Yours, and I'm sure if you ask nicely, she'd be happy to sign for you as well. All right, I think that's all. Thank you all so much for coming out again. Let's give you two more minutes.